drunken wailer? What will we do with a drunken wailer? What will we do with a drunken wailer early in the morning?
Dishonored is a game that has seemed to develop universal unconditional praise in the years since its release in 2012. Dishonored made me feel like a person struggling to retain the things that were most important to me in a world gone mad. It goes beyond role-playing to challenge players to draw their own personal moral line in the sand, but does so without being preachy or judgmental. A masterpiece, colorful characters, one of the best games ever. It should be a crime not to play this amazing game. It's this attitude, this hyperbolic and oversimplistic veneration that I find the most confusing about Dishonored. That's not to say I hate the game. I like Dishonored. It's beautiful, it's open, and it's got expansive and wide level design, but it has a tragic amount of missed potential and misfiring but well-intentioned game design ideas. It is not a terrible game. I have no doubt that this is a game made with passion and skill, but its central design ideas went wrong on so many levels that I find the reception this game has gotten to be totally absurd. Dishonored is an amalgamation of a bunch of games that on paper sounds like it would make the best game ever. Take the stealth gameplay and setting of Thief, combine it with the level design and multiple approaches of Deus Ex, and throw in the two-handed powers and offensive weapon gameplay of Bioshock, and you've got the recipe for the perfect game. But none of these individual elements are done as strongly as any of its inspirations. Thief is still a better stealth game, Deus Ex is still more open, Bioshock has more varied and interesting powers. It's these mechanical inspirations that Dishonored fumbles the most. Dishonored's most fundamental and glaring problem is its binary design, mechanically, structurally, and narratively. It corrupts absolutely every part of the game in ways big and small. Mechanically, it perverts its boasting about the respect of player choice. This so-called respect ends up creating a total gameplay and narrative contradiction. Dishonored is a game that brands itself as play it your way. There is a wide array of options to handle each and every situation, and while this is welcome and true when it comes to the level design and the multiple approaches you have while exploring, this mostly boils down to either doing a pacifist playthrough or a murderer playthrough when it comes to direct contact with enemies. It's possible to complete Dishonored without killing a single person, and that's extremely admirable. Even Deus Ex Human Revolution messed this up by forcing in obnoxious, unnecessary, and unbalanced boss fights. But the problem with this binary moral system is the problem with all binary moral systems. It has to pick a side to prioritize and ends up heavily encouraging the pacifist route through the story and the writing. You will be judged constantly for playing aggressively, and the city will actually get worse, with more rats spreading plague and more guards around the map the more people that fall by your hand. The game does have a built-in defense for killing by preserving the low chaos state as long as more than 75% of guards are left alive at the end of the level, but that number is completely unknown to the player ahead of time, so they have no idea how many screw-ups will lead to a seemingly arbitrary shift in player choice impact. Whenever you are spotted, unfortunately, the safest thing to do is just reload. The fact that the game brands killing as inherently bad is disappointing and pushes the player towards a pacifist playstyle instead of killing. I get that the idea is to show that actions have consequences. Your choices actually matter. The more people you kill, the worse the city gets. See, look how much player choice this game has. But the game treats this binary morality too simplistically. It would have been better for the game to remain neutral on a moral stance. They should provide consequences for the player's actions, but treating killing as inherently bad and pacifism as inherently good is a big misstep. And this feeds into the largest mechanical problem in the game. While the story heavily encourages a pacifist playstyle, the gameplay mechanics heavily encourages the opposite. Dishonored's stealth mechanics are as bare bones as you can get, with the most basic line of sight stealth with very minimal noise mechanics, no light mechanics, no large array of deception or non-lethal tools for the player, none of that. You press the crouch button and you don't stand directly in front of enemies, and that's it. Compared to its primary inspiration Thief, it's blatantly obvious just how much it left behind. Beyond the aforementioned light and noise systems that made Thief such a classic, it also contained a wide array of tools focused on deception instead of straight up murder. Staples such as water arrows to darken lit up rooms, moss arrows to soften the noise of clanking floors, or rope arrows for alternate and not obviously highlighted paths were used to give the player non-lethal and deception focused utility. Speaking of which, the easiest way to deal with enemies in Thief is with the Blackjack, a quick bop across the head that renders guards unconscious almost immediately. Dishonored's answer to this is a sleep hold with a prolonged animation. I think the idea was to make a non-lethal playstyle more challenging and by extension more rewarding, but this quickly becomes a chore even with the bone charm that decreases the length of this animation. And when it comes to non-lethal tools, it takes a different approach. Dishonored's most effective and useful tools are a set of supernatural powers given to you by the Outsider, a nebulous character with cryptic motivations who resides in a place called the Void, but has obvious influence among the dark corners of the city. The powers are pretty much the one thing that make Dishonored unique among stealth games and do their best to make up for the lackluster core stealth mechanics. You've got Blink, a short-range teleport for navigating the vertical and horizontal space of the levels, Dark Vision, a Batman Arkham-style X-ray vision, Slow Time, exactly like it sounds, that can be upgraded to fully stop time, Possession, allowing you control of rats and eventually humans to slip under grates and move enemy positions, Wind Blast, a lethal blast of air for crowd control, and Devouring Swarm, summoning a congregation of rats that can be combined with Possession or just used as your own little army. But because the game deliberately encourages two strict playstyles, Devouring Swarm and Wind Blast are useless for a non-lethal playthrough. Slow Time, Blink, and Dark Vision are versatile enough to be useful on any character build, but it's disappointing that two of the most satisfying powers have no utility for the playstyle the game actively encourages. The equipment in the game is even worse, being almost exclusively lethal. Spring razors, grenades, guns, incendiary bolts, nope, can't use any of that if you don't want the game to yell at you and actively make the game world worse. The game also has a power bar with consumables available for recharging it, similar to Eve in BioShock, but it feels like an unwarranted concession based off of admiration than a practical and useful mechanic. BioShock is a survival horror FPS RPG about inventory and supply management. It makes sense for there to be a limited amount of uses and supplies for its powers. Dishonored, above all else, is a stealth game, and its most useful power, Blink, is essential for moving around the game world. Even worse, the power bar recharges on its own after Blink is used, just after a few seconds of waiting. This almost completely invalidates the point of power bar consumables if it wasn't for the other powers, and it turns the pacing into a lurchy mess. Unless you want to be downing consumables every 5 steps, the optimal strategy is to blink and then stand around and wait for 5 seconds. Ad nauseum. It's a minor issue that becomes infuriating over time. Speaking of infuriating, the game's combat mechanics, the playstyle the game seems to actively discourage, are the complete opposite. They are really good and satisfying. Sword fighting is intense, and parrying sword strikes are followed up with brutal and smooth animations. Powers like Wind Blast and Slow Time can be combined to make the player feel like a god amongst men, slaughtering entire rooms with over-the-top abilities that make it feel like BioShock with a sword instead of guns. There's so much variation and fun to be had in a lethal playstyle, but almost none to be had in a non-lethal playstyle. Playing non-lethally means that every level plays exactly the same. You crouch around and use Blink to traverse the levels and then choke out enemies from behind with an overlong animation and then hide their bodies. The only other tool at your disposal is the sleep darts for the crossbow, which is your only defense if you get spotted or have to deal with multiple enemies in the same room. You know it's a problem when the stealth mechanics in your supposed premium stealth title are literally the same mechanics from fucking Battlefield campaigns. If the stealth mechanics were more evolved, actually taking into consideration lighting and noise levels dependent on different surfaces, then a pacifist playthrough could have been so much more rewarding and interesting. But therein lies the problem. If different surfaces made different noises and the lighting engine had to be designed to incorporate them, then it would completely change the entire paradigm of the design. Enemy placement and levels would have to be changed drastically to incorporate all the new stealth mechanics, and that would mean the current dynamic would be flipped on its head and make a lethal playstyle the less fun of the two. The levels just wouldn't be designed for it. It's why personally, I hate this wishy-washy play-it-your-way style design that was introduced in Deus Ex and has been increasing in popularity ever since. This system is praised so often because it gives the player options. It's not just an action game, you can play it like a stealth game too. And this is always seen as an inherent positive. But I just don't understand why this isn't pointed out more. More often than not, it just dilutes both styles of gameplay into something bland instead of reaching their full individual potential. Just make a good action game or make a good stealth game. You can't have both. Trying to cram both into the same game for the sake of options just means that both paths are restricted and have to accommodate for a conflicting gameplay style on top of it. Now, not every game does this entirely wrong. I love role-playing games and they offer the player different playstyles as well. But good ones don't treat its morality so simplistically and make the game world objectively worse just for killing people. Fallout New Vegas judges you for killing, but in a much more nuanced way that doesn't detract from its design. Killing people will earn you certain favor with some factions, but lose favor with others. It's not treated as inherently good or bad. Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines is actually designed pretty similarly, but doesn't significantly change the game world based off of the player's lust for blood, which is absolutely the more fun way to play that game. They are designed much more loosely in terms of enemy placement and mechanics, but I'm willing to mostly accept that because it's a role-playing game that's more about the story and world, which both those games thrive at. Dishonored doesn't even manage to get the story right. Unlike a dystopian cyberpunk city or a magic versus steampunk city or a fallen city underwater, Dishonored takes place in a steampunk Victorian crumbling city called Dunwall. It's mostly inspired by the unnamed city in Thief, but while Thief had a visual clash of magic and steampunk technology, Dishonored mostly goes for the steampunk, although in this case it's more whale punk. Dishonored's world is powered by whale oil, which is an interesting twist on this motif. Whale oil is even used as a mechanic to power down many of the powerful technologies in the game, such as watchtowers and walls of light. It's a world that has visual beauty and uniqueness, but is obviously crumbling. A rat plague is destroying the city, an entire district has been flooded and condemned to stop it. Its politics are unstable and is populated with greedy and awful people constantly making grabs for power. The world is a gorgeous and unique blend of art styles and complicated lore, so that's why it's so confounding and disappointing that the story ended up the way it did. Dishonored's story is as bland as a cardboard and sawdust sandwich. It's got so much visual personality in its art style and its creative world, but absolutely none when it comes to its writing or its performances. You play as Corvo Atano, royal protector of the Empress of Dunwall, returning from a failed expedition to seek help from the other cities for the rat plague destroying the city. You're introduced to Emily, the daughter of the Empress, and clearly very close to Corvo, and almost immediately the problems with the voice acting begin to show. Emily is voiced by Chloe Grace Moretz of Kick-Ass fame, who is a very talented actress, but here, it's just so flat.
I'll cover my eyes and you hide. You have time? Mother's busy talking to that nasty old spy master.
The voice acting is bland and barely passable. The game has a problem with people. Its world is visually interesting and there's some good background details with notes and eavesdropping conversations, but its characters are boring and barely distinguishable from one another, and the voice acting isn't distinct or interesting in any way. It has to be a problem with whoever was directing the actors, because almost every single character in this entire game sounds like they read their lines from home, completely separated from any other actors to play off of, or from a good director trying to get decent performances from them. Take Granny Rags, for example. She is supposed to be this terrifying demon in the form of a harmless old woman, but she sounds like someone a designer met at the grocery store and decided to record lines for their exciting new AAA IP on the spot with no rehearsals or prior training at all.
Listen, Granny has a birthday present for you. I got it from the outsider, and now I'm giving it to you. Go on. It's upstairs. On the vanity. I think you'll cut a nice figure with it. Remember how we used to dance?
Or take the Outsider, for instance. He's a mysterious, otherworldly figure with vast unknown power that grants his mark to notable people in the world. He's kind of reminiscent of the G-Man in the way that he sits on the periphery of the experience, always there, always watching. There's a great idea for a character in there somewhere, but as usual, the voice acting absolutely kills it.
Your life has taken a turn, has it not? The Empress is dead. Her precious daughter Emily is lost somewhere in the city, and you will play a pivotal role in the days to come. For this, I have chosen you and drawn you into the void.
There's no personality, there's no flair. Considering most of the voice-acted characters in Thief didn't even have in-game models, you'd think their performances would be de-emphasized, but no. They actually put a ton of effort into the performances and gave us Garrett, one of the most perfectly cast characters in video games, completely inseparable from his iconic voice.
I've always equated feelings with getting caught. They both get in the way of my money. Unfortunately, not everyone is as committed to their work as I am. An old associate of mine, Basso the Boxman, wants to marry Lady Rumford's chambermaid, Genevieve, and live happily ever after. Guess prison life spoiled his taste for thievery. Basso has asked for my assistance on getting her out, since infiltration is my specialty. I make it a policy never to take a job so sentimental, but the Rumford Manor could be a lucrative opportunity for a man like me. It would also mean that Basso would owe me a favor, and in this line of work you can never have too many of those.
Instead of trying to create a new stealth icon who can compete with Garrett or Agent 47 or Sam Fisher, Arcane decided to make Corvo a silent protagonist, which turns out to be incredibly frustrating when he's accused of murdering the Empress 5 minutes in and can't defend himself. It's not quite dramatic irony, it's something else entirely. There's probably a phrase for this, but if there is, I've never heard it myself, so I'm going to make my own. Corvo is guilty of arbitrarily dictated silence. You can talk in Dishonored, but only when the game decides it's time, and this is usually just a be nice or be arbitrarily evil option instead of any opportunity for character development or impactful choices. Otherwise, Corvo just stands around like a dolt and does everything complete strangers tell him to do. Video games have used silent protagonists many times and have used them well, but they mostly use them for much more minimal stories or winkily acknowledge the silence of the player character to make it not seem so artificial. It's used so poorly here. Corvo is supposed to be a master assassin in charge of his own destiny, planning how to take out those who wronged him, but all it really consists of is getting rescued by a group of revolutionaries called the Loyalists and then getting ordered around with faux compliments and civility with obvious ulterior motives, mission after mission. Now, there's something that you need to know about the Loyalists before we go any further. They're not actually human, they're aliens disguised as humans performing an experiment on how well they can impersonate humans. It's actually a big twist that comes up later in the game. They aren't very good at it. As with every other character in the game, they're just so shallow and bland and forgettable. I can accurately describe every character with one sentence. The military man, the ruthless elite, the quirky inventor, the nice maid? Since they are, after all, aliens who showed up in UFOs, their idea of human personalities is the most simplistic possible stereotypes. Alright, I know, I'm harping on the story in a gameplay-focused game. Honestly, I would prefer if this game had no story, or at least a much more minimalist, less intrusive story like Thief did than the current state of it. It's not just that the story is bland, it's that it's obviously proud of its story and its characters because of how much you have to talk to them. Instead of just buying your equipment between missions, you have to go back to the Loyalist HQ every time between missions. The world ironically feels more alive the less time you spend with living things. Whenever people are talking in this game, I completely zone out. When blinking around the rooftops in a dystopian, crumpling world dripping with visual artistry is when I feel the most connected. Alright, I need to back up a bit. I know this is a game a lot of people like. Some people even consider this their favorite game ever. Ever. There is things I like about Dishonored. There is just so much that I dislike about it that I tend to sound more negative about it than I actually am. This is not an awful game. I think it's a good game with a lot of bad decisions holding it back. As much as I hate the binary morality choice and the bland voice acting and story, Dishonored's level design is outstanding and some of the best in the past few years. It's open in a way that encourages poking your nose in every little corner and has routes for virtually every playstyle from rooftop infiltration to underwater or underground entrances. or even possessing rats that crawl into tiny grates and multiple variations of each entrance. The first few levels of the game are some of the largest in size. The prison and the sewer are decent-ish tutorial levels, being extremely linear and with very generous enemy placement, but are definitely a slog on replays. The game's first proper mission, High Overseer Campbell, and its successor, the Golden Cat, both take place in the same massive city block with a main city area with rooftops, guards, and the Wall of Light, and many optional areas rewarding exploration. This is also connected to another entire area in the distillery and then splits off to 2 more enormous areas for the first 2 proper missions. High Overseer Campbell is a multi-story complex with long hallways and a ton of optional rooms, including a secret room for Campbell himself. You are tasked with assassinating a target in most missions, but the game gives you a good amount of options to deal with each one. Now, it's no Hitman, there's only one non-lethal way to kill a target for each level, but it's always a really good one that requires the player to do some extra work on the side that actually makes it feel like you accomplished something when you pull it off. Walking right up to your target and slitting their throat is easy. Having to carry an unconscious body across a hallway, blinking from chandelier to avoid being seen, is tense and exciting in a way that the game often struggles to pull off. The non-lethal elimination in this level is to brand Campbell as a heretic, which gets him exiled from the Overseers, and you eventually find him later in the game as a Weeper, one of Dishonored's plague victims that basically becomes zombies. Dishonored is a game about assassination and revenge ultimately, and it's in dealing with your primary targets that Dishonored's most unique and charismatic design decision, the intricately structured and robust non-lethal options for each target, is corrupted once again by its adherence to binary moral choice. Sparing your targets of death is good. The opposite is bad, according to the game anyways. The problem with this is that the game's own carefully designed fates for these targets range from indisputably savage, cruel, and downright depraved. Some of these non-lethal eliminations are horrible, just horrible when you think about them, and that makes it all the more tone-deaf and confusing when Corvo is deified as a hero at the end for some of these actions. The Pendletons run a mine that abuses its workers with terrible working conditions and stringent contracts, so how do you get them back for that? Cut out their tongues, shave their heads, and force them to work in their own mines until their bodies eventually give out. Deserved? Maybe, but does anyone deserve that kind of punishment? Even the people in charge of its perpetuation? Or take Lady Boyle, for example. All she really did was assist in the assassination of the Empress by lying. She's not a killer. She doesn't abuse her own staff. In fact, she throws exotic and fashionable parties that everybody seems to enjoy. So does she deserve to be knocked out and kidnapped by an admirer who will keep her locked in his basement forever until she learns to love him? And the game thinks that this is the good option. More often than not, the non-lethal eliminations made me feel like a scumbag taking revenge way too far. The only non-lethal option in the game I think is totally solid is the Lord Regent. It's a political revenge instead of barbaric or pervy, and that's why it feels like the actual good option this time. The Lord Regent is one of the only characters in the game who is decently voice acted and is an irredeemable, conniving, greedy liar, willing to start the rat plague for his lust for power. He is the one responsible for the rat plague in the first place, captured by an audio device in his room, and you can give this to the propaganda officer to spread it to the whole of Dunwall. He gets what he deserves. Public humiliation and certain death, not a life of constant pain and misery or, misery. The Golden Cat is on a smaller scale than the High Overseer, but very well concentrated and balanced. This is the classic Dishonored mission in many ways. It's the one heavily advertised before release for its balance of unique art style and demonstration of the vast majority of Dishonored's mechanics and level design in clever and charismatic ways. You can even torture an art dealer strapped in his kinky electric chair for information. Dishonored's other quirky inventor is Sokolov, who have a Fink and Suchong dynamic years before that DLC even came out for Bioshock Infinite. They're rival inventors who have both developed many of the technologies in the game, from the whale oil to the various remedies. The third mission tasks you with capturing Sokolov from his apartment in the Bridge District. This area is quite cleverly placed in the overall game because it's at the point that the player has probably finally upgraded Blink and can start taking advantage of the large open space and verticality in this level. It's less challenging than either of the 2 previous levels, but it is a good change of pace and shows off a different side to the city not seen previously, as well as utilizing the fantastic blink power and freedom of movement. It's also beautiful, being set at sunset and showing off Dishonored's quite engaging whale punk heavily stylized art style. Ask any fan of Dishonored what their favorite level was and it would be almost unanimously Lady Boyle's party. Dishonored is a combination of a lot of stealth game motifs like Thief and Deus Ex, but this is when it finally goes full Hitman. Lady Boyle is throwing a masked party in her mansion, which gives Corvo the perfect disguise. You can explore the mansion freely outside of restricted rooms. It's not a massive level, but there is a fairly large area on the top level containing each of the 3 Boyle women's rooms with a few guards to avoid. The real hook of the level is the layers of infiltration, the wandering the main floor of the party freely scoping out opportunities, and the sneaking around on the higher levels not trying to disrupt the facade of the party. It makes for a compelling and different experience than the other more stealth-focused levels. The final real assassination mission of the game is the Lord Regent himself, and this is my pick for the best level of the main game, it being what I think is the largest single loading screen level in the game. It's a huge multi-story complex with a lengthy ascension from the ship to the top of the tower, a large outside fort filled with guards, the huge complex itself with multiple floors and lots of hidden rooms, vertical cover, and even an optional library at the top with a mission briefing room. This level really feels like when everything is coming together. The players should have a substantial amount of upgrades at this point, so it's when the level design becomes its most open with the most amount of options given to the player at a single time. However, it's after this point that Dishonored takes a turn, and I would argue, not a particularly strong one. You've taken down all of your opposition. The High Overseer, the Pendletons, Sokolov, Lady Boyle, and the Lord Regent himself. When you head back to the Hound Pit's pub to celebrate, it's patently obvious that there's no way the artificially friendly Admiral Havelock is just going to put Emily on the throne for no personal gain of his own. So in a huge twist, the loyalists reveal themselves as aliens, only capable of the most basic and predictable human emotions possible. They poison you and lock Emily away to put themselves in power. Because they are aliens, they have no idea about nuance and conflicting traits that characterize most of us squishy humans. They think being human is simply about greed and power. It's actually brilliant writing that expresses the human condition in contrast. Thankfully, there's one member of the Loyalists who isn't actually an alien in disguise, and that's Samuel, who only gave you enough poison to render you unconscious, and then dumps you in the flooded district where you can recover. Daud's assassins find you and throw your equipment down a hole, and now you've got to break out of prison again, get equipment again, and get your revenge once again too. I get that the point is to put Corvo at his lowest point, but the twist involving aliens is a weird plot point for this game, and it's what follows this that breaks the immense focus and balance that the earlier levels achieve so carefully. The Flooded District has some really good moments, and is maybe the most gorgeous level of the game, with huge open spaces and decayed waterlogged buildings, but it's not really a stealth level or a combat level. Instead, we've got acid-shooting Venus flytrap monsters? What the fuck? What are these things doing in this game? I have no clue. They're incredibly awkward to fight, and they aren't connected to the morality mechanics that the game really wants to be impactful. There isn't a ton of them, but whenever these things are on screen, I usually just run past them as fast as I can and pretend they don't exist. This is not Half-Life, it's not about enemy and gameplay variety. Dishonored is a game designed specifically around its two playstyles. You've also got the final confrontation with Granny Rags here, and it falls just as flat as the earlier moments with her. I get what the developers wanted this to feel like. You're at your lowest point, descending further and further into the hell that is this sewer when you find the ancient, shape-shifting demon about to cook Slackjaw alive. It's supposed to be disgusting and terrifying, putting you up against a foe much more dangerous than you are, but once again, it's just so boring.
My love, are you ready to help get Slackjaw's bones? Granny has some birthday gifts for you. I've been saving them up in case you ever came back to me.
Granny Rags is pathetically easy even on a higher difficulty, and the presentation of it is so lacking that it kills the mood the game wanted to achieve. It's the most frustrating because I see the potential. I could see a monster truly creative coming out of this world, but the game just put no effort into the voice acting or the mood. Dishonored so often fails to direct its genuinely talented voice actors in a compelling way or write them in a way that gives them proper character motivation and nuance. But there's one character in Dishonored that completely avoids this problem. Daud, the assassin of the Empress, is Dishonored's one and only character that is not only well voice acted, but is actually capable of emotions other than greed. Daud is voiced by Michael Madsen of Reservoir Dogs fame, and his gruff, weathered delivery is spot on for the legendary assassin of Dunwall. It's not necessarily proper voice direction, but fantastic casting.
I recognize those marks on your hand. A gift from your friend. The one who talks to you in the dark. Talks to you when you visit his shrines. I visited those shrines too. And I know what it felt like to shove a blade into your Empress. But I don't know you. Who you are, and who you fight for. You're a mystery. And I can't allow that.
Daud actually feels guilty for the Empress's death. It feels contrived because he's an assassin. I mean, he says himself he's done much worse. Probably much worse. But I think they wrote him that way because they began to realize that the alien twist robbed the game of any complex characters. But even though it feels contrived, and I wish there was more to it, it's just so goddamn entrancing to have a character properly casted and voice acted and actually has some kind of emotion. You have another killer spare choice with Daud, and it actually feels personally motivated and has some depth. He did kill the Empress you served for years and, later revealed to be Corvo's lover. He did lock you in a hole and throw away your stuff, but he genuinely feels regret for what he did. It's a more interesting choice than kill or do something worse than death to a one-dimensional megalomaniac. It's this time both a gameplay choice and a proper moral choice, the one the game actually gets. Daud is the best character in Dishonored, hands down. Honestly, I wish he was the main character. Playing as an assassin responsible for some of the worst crimes in Dunwall and feeling regret could have been a way more interesting story and worked into the moral choices much more strongly. Moral choices wouldn't have been entirely based on the moral rot of the antagonist, but how the player chooses to play Daud too. Does Daud further perpetuate the lifestyle that led to an action he regrets, or does he try and change? Especially with Michael Madsen's excellent voice work, we could have maybe had a new stealth icon like Garrett or Agent 47. The problem with Corvo isn't that he doesn't have the potential for depth. Giving the player options on how to handle their targets means Corvo can go a multitude of ways on the moral spectrum, but robbing him of a voice for seemingly no reason and only allowing the most basic of responses at seemingly random times makes Corvo feel like less of a character and more like a blank slate. There's only a couple more levels at this point and only one proper mission since the Lord Regent. Corvo heads back to the Hound Pit's pub to find Emily, and this time is confronted by enemy soldiers occupying the place. It's reusing a level from before, but it's done in a clever way because you've gotten to know the place so well that it becomes a joke in terms of difficulty. The occupying soldiers have no idea what they are in for, and it becomes hilariously easy to quickly knock out each of the objectives, and then eventually render all of them unconscious with the arc pylon developed by Sokolov and Piero, now working together. The final mission is King Sparrow Isle, and while it's better than the Flooded District or the Hound Pit's pub, it's still not quite as good as the early and mid-game levels. It contributes to a feeling of rushed production near the end. Admiral Havelock, Pendleton, and Overseer Martin are at the top of the lighthouse, and apparently, Pendleton and Martin are dead. For some reason, Havelock is muttering to himself about Corvo's imminent revenge, and this doesn't make any sense. How does he know Corvo is still alive? He left Corvo with Samuel to be dumped in the Flooded District. Since then, Corvo confronted Daud, who is an assassin living away from anybody in the public, and then dealt with the soldiers at the Hound Pit's pub, but they are all unconscious. Then Corvo goes right from the Hound Pit's pub to the final mission. I don't know how anybody would have gotten word, since there doesn't appear to be telephones in the game. Most people have written letters, and the second game has interactive typewriters scattered around the game. It's another weird choice that feels incredibly rushed. But if you thought randomly contrived character decisions and lackluster levels seemed rushed, then you haven't seen anything yet.
Learn how to behave. Corvo! I knew you'd come. Is it going to be okay now? Will I be Empress?
So ends the interregnum, and now Emily Caldwin the First will take her mother's throne.
It's not like the ending comes completely out of nowhere. Dealing with the loyalists and rescuing Emily is the logical endpoint of the story. It's that it cuts to black so jarringly and then goes on to put Deus Ex and Bioshock to shame in shitty post-game epilogues. The superficial fairy tale tone of the ending and the total lack of addressing the player's specific actions on the world is completely unsatisfying. It even says that Corvo will die old and gray with Emily putting flowers on his grave. Great, so not only have you fucked up the ending to this game, but you've spoiled the next one too. Thanks, Arcane. Dishonored so often can inspire a deep explorative instinct and give the player immense mobility and power, but it can't figure out how to use more than basic line of sight to drive its stealth gameplay or how to direct its actors to give some personality to the world. After the huge disappointment of the ending and the numerous central design problems, it made me weary of the Dishonored series' future. Weary enough to where I did not play the DLC until working on this video, and I really wish I wouldn't have waited so long. Dishonored has 2 story DLCs, and they are some of the most substantial, high-quality DLCs that I've played in years. Right off the bat, this DLC spoke to me immediately by taking some of the unvoiced criticisms I've had about the game and directly addressing them. You get to play as Daud in both of the DLCs, the Knife of Dunwall and the Brigmore Witches. The best character in Dishonored gets his own DLC, which ends up completely outclassing the main game in every single way except scope. Although the story still isn't super compelling, the main character actually is this time, and man, that makes a huge difference in terms of player engagement. The level design is a massive, massive improvement over the main game. Its 2 major levels are extremely high quality and superior to anything in the main game. It's an improvement in size, art style, and variety. Daud's upgraded and different powers give the DLC a different feel than the main game, and it even got rid of going back to the Hound Pits between missions and replaced it with a store screen between missions just like Thief. It expands on Daud's plight of the main game, primarily his guilt over the Empress's death. While the reasoning for it still doesn't quite make sense, the exploration of his character and how it affects him does, and is maybe the first bit of interesting character work the series has managed to pull off. Michael Madsen returns to voice Daud and is given a lot more material to work with than before. He's still hands down the best voice actor in the series, and shining the spotlight on him puts his talents front and center. The first level of the Knife of Dunwall is the best level in all of the first Dishonored experience. Captain of Industry is a massive whale oil production facility which shows one of the more unique world details up close and personal, and it is an ugly truth. Whale oil is produced while the whales are still alive in excruciating pain and misery. Rivers of blood flowing into the sewers, dirty floors and unsafe working conditions. Whale corpses are chopped up by a handsaw in a pile of meat and bones. The art style of Dishonored is at its all-time high here, with the massive open spaces, sharp contrast of gore, and the beautiful vistas at sunset. This level has so much horizontal space that it seems daunting at first, and it has a surprising amount of vertical space too for some hidden secrets. There's even a ton of options to handle this level, from the non-lethal option of shipping the ruthless owner to a faraway place with nothing to his name, to blowing up the entire factory and destroying its cruelty forever, to deciding the fate of the still alive whale being drained of oil. It evokes a ton of sympathy from its broken appearance and its pained screams. I just could not let the thing stay there and decided to put it out of its misery. While it's unfortunate that the first level of the DLC ends up being the best, that doesn't mean the rest of the DLC lacks quality. The second level is still better designed than any of the main game levels, but whose art style is a lot more safe and less impressive than Captain of Industry. It's typical gray inner city that looks like it could have taken place right next to a level from the main game. While I would have appreciated a more unique setting and art style, the design is still great. This level has one of the best non-lethal eliminations in the series. Barrister Timish has been abusing his power by forcing families out of their homes for fabricated plague infections. You can kill him like normal, or you can pump in an odor from a sack in a condemned house and steal his letter of immunity from him, so that when the guards show up, he is arrested for the crime he has subjected others to. It's an ironic reversal that the main game tried to do, but too often came off as overkill or just plain creepy and gross. The third mission is a reskin, which is a little disappointing, but used a little differently this time and makes sense in the context of the story. It's Daud's hideout from the main game, but this time, your task was saving your assassins from groups of overseers around the map. It's the same map basically in design, but with different enemy placement and objectives. It's disappointing overall that there wasn't anything new, but I get the intention and the connection they wanted to make with the main game's timeline. The DLC ends with Billy Lurk revealing her betrayal to Daud and the main villain of the DLC, Delilah, posturing for her future role. Billy's reaction varies depending on the chaos level, and it feels contradictory. If you are in low chaos, Billy will be regretful for her betrayal, but if you are in high chaos, she will stand by her choice and end up challenging Daud to a duel. The whole reason Billy chose to betray Daud in the first place was because she felt he was slipping because of his job on the Empress. But wouldn't Daud suddenly changing his tune and choose not to assassinate his targets, the thing he's being paid for, would be the thing that causes her to doubt him? It's another example of the flawed reasoning of a binary moral choice system. It brands killing as inherently bad, disrespectful of the context. The Knife of Dunwall on the whole, despite some of its core failings brought over from the main game, improves quite a lot over the original title, and focusing the development team's efforts on just a few unique levels churned out their best work yet. The second part of Daud's story, the Brigmore Witches, is more polished and precise. The levels feel more consistent, the story better paced and more eventful. Funnily enough, the first level of the Brigmore Witches is another reskin, but a genuinely good one this time that actually does use its level in a completely new way that makes it feel totally separate from the main game's portrayal. You're back at the Coldridge prison where Corvo escaped from, but this time, here to break out a boat captain to take you to Delilah's residence. During the Between Missions store screen, you'll regularly have access to alternate help, like runes being dropped off or keys that can help you on the mission. Here, you have the option of dressing up as an overseer and can use the disguise to walk the prison freely. Like the Lady Boyle mission, it's another espionage level of sneaking into restricted areas and doing some behind-the-scenes work, not trying to compromise your disguise. It even has possibly the largest total area with multiple loading screens of the entire first game. The Draper's Ward is the residential block of Dunwall with stores for the upper class citizens before it was overrun by competing gangs in the area. It reminds me a lot of Emporia from BioShock Infinite. Run-down upper-class beauty, wide open spaces, and inner-city alleys. This might also be the longest quest in the game because it's multi-part. First, you have to secure the boat you'll be traveling to and then get the engine core from a different gang while making a deal with their leader and encountering a whole other plotline of witches in the sewer. The only thing I'm not stoked on is the return of the acid-shooting Venus flytrap monsters. Why? The Brigmore Manor itself is the final level of the DLC packed with Delilah's Coven. It's a waterlogged, flooded mansion with a great amount of horizontal space and secret areas packed into the decaying house. It's the best level in the game of its type, although I still don't think it's able to top a Captain of Industry. It's unfortunate that despite the intriguing art and backstory of the mansion, Delilah turns out to be a hugely disappointing villain. She, like almost every character in Dishonored, is pretty weak, just wanting to paint Emily so that she can possess her and rule Dunwall. Just another power-lusted maniac, really. But as typical for Dishonored, although the story and the dialogue disappoint and the gameplay is a little too simple, the level design is what saves it, and this is even more true in the DLC than the main game with its consistently expansive and creative levels. But unlike Dishonored, the DLC has something else, and that's Daud. His charisma and the intrigue of his confliction carries the weaker parts of the game along with the levels. Daud's inclusion is the best thing the DLC could have done, giving the experience a playable character that's actually interesting and compelling. So naturally, the DLC ends on the pivotal moment from the main game when Corvo confronts him. Only this time, it's the other way around and you have to be judged by Corvo. It's the perfect way to end the Dishonored experience, reflecting your choices back on you and giving new perspective to a pivotal scene from the main game. Daud is Dishonored's one and only character with actual depth. I'm thrilled they decided to give him a lengthy and well-made adventure that surpasses the main game in nearly every way. Dishonored 2 ran like a car with no wheels being pulled by a horse on a gravel road on release. It was for this reason that I avoided playing it until making this video. I'm happy to say that in its current state, Dishonored 2 can barely stay at 60 FPS on a GTX 1080 regardless of the settings. Okay, so Dishonored 2 doesn't run very well. But thankfully, technical issues aside, and those are some pretty fucking big ones, Dishonored 2 improves massively over the original game structurally and artistically. This is a game much more honest about what it actually is, instead of trying to be something that it wasn't. Instead of the whale-punk grim and grey city of Dunwall, Dishonored 2 takes place in the much more exotic and vibrant Karnaca, a coastal southern city with tangential connections to Dunwall. Karnaca is a lot dirtier and hostile than Dunwall ever was. It's a lot more fully realized as well, visually, historically, and culturally. Instead of a rat plague, Karnaca is afflicted by a bloodfly infestation which functions mechanically pretty similar to the rats. Walk too close to a nest too fast and you'll get swarmed by bloodflies, but you can simply destroy their nests or move very slowly to avoid them. Despite the vibrant blues and browns, Karnaca is in a much darker place compared to Dunwall. The Duke of the city lives in an opulent mansion while the rest of the population is suffering in slums and poor working conditions in the mines, all with a serial killer called the Crown Killer on the loose. The technology of Karnaca is much more exotic compared to Dunwall this time as well. Huge, mechanically complex machinery like clocks and typewriters look artistically beautiful and ground Karnaca as a real place. Instead of technology developed by Sokolov and Piero, Karnaca is home to another great inventor responsible for this technology. Kirin Jindosh is Dishonored 2's new inventor, and he is without a doubt the most charismatic and interesting villain the series has so far produced. He's created an army of Clockwork soldiers, 7 feet tall golden structures with eyes on the back of their heads and electrical and physical capabilities that he's planning to expand to the entire of the city. His home, the Clockwork Mansion, is filled with all kinds of unique and beautiful technology and also the best level in the game. Dishonored's level design was open and expansive comparative to most games of the time it released, but it never held a candle to the titans of the industry that it took inspiration from, like Deus Ex and Thief. Dishonored 2, probably because of the release on new consoles, manages to get within striking distance of those icons this time around. Not necessarily through size and scope, although it's still much closer in that aspect, but through creativity and variety. The Clockwork Mansion's primary addition is the inclusion of shifting floors and rooms activated by the flick of a switch. Not only will the rooms change appearance and structure, but during the transformation, you can sneak in between the machinery to uncover secrets and shortcuts throughout the level. It's a brilliant addition to level design that encourages a lot of clever manipulation on the player's part and brings exploration to the forefront. Exploration was certainly present in Dishonored 1, but it was never hugely time-consuming or all that well realized. Dishonored 2, a lot of times, feels less like a stealth action hybrid and more like an exploration-focused collect-a-thon to collect the numerous runes and bone charms essential for upgrades and player customization throughout the levels. The game it reminds me of the most isn't Dishonored 1, but Deus Ex Mankind Divided. The levels are structured pretty similarly, massive cascading city blocks dense with apartments and multiple ways in and out of each. But unlike Mankind Divided, the detail isn't there just for the sake of its immersive sim qualities. These apartments and rooms are usually filled with useful upgrade materials, runes, and bone charms. Dishonored 2 put a ton of effort into making rune and bone charm collecting both rewarding and challenging. Most runes and bone charms aren't just sitting in optional areas out in the open this time. They are locked into little navigational puzzles like finding a safe code or hidden in a secret route. It makes collecting runes feel less like a chore and more like an essential part of the game. The Clockwork Mansion especially excels at this because of the shifting floors. Some of the runes and bone charms are located in between the crawl spaces between rooms. It becomes a puzzle of observing the movement of rooms to find where the rooms open in a way for the player to slip in. Dishonored 2 even uses this shifting floors concept differently on a later level where you are given a timepiece by the outsider that can transport you to the past and present with the click of a mouse. Similar to the shifting rooms of the Clockwork Mansion, you can avoid obstacles in the present or past by switching time periods when an object was in a different place. This is even taken to some insanely cool and creative heights when you can perform an action in the past that then affects the present timeline, like hitting the supports on this balcony or throwing a dead dog in the incinerator to reveal a safe code. This even extends beyond the mission alone, affecting things in the present world by returning Megan Foster's arm and eye, Stilton himself, and restoring the Dust District to its former glory if you save Stilton during the mission. Your powers are disabled on this level, which means that the timepiece can even be used mechanically in conflict by using the little viewfinder to navigate the levels unseen. It's extremely creative and works wonders of switching up the core gameplay of power-focused sneaking or killing. Unfortunately, that core gameplay, the thing I complained about so much in Dishonored 1, hasn't been overhauled to a drastic degree. They have made some positive changes, like adding a non-lethal parry, so if you do get caught, you aren't forced to run for non-lethal playthroughs, but some old problems have gotten worse, and some new issues have shown up. I said the power recharge time was too long in Dishonored 1, so what was their solution to that? Make it even longer by default. Gee, thanks, Arcane Studios. Even with the bone charm that decreases this time, it's still noticeably longer than in the first game, so that time spent waiting around for the power bar to recharge has just gotten arbitrarily longer for some reason. The chokeout time in Dishonored 1 was a minor issue, mostly solved by the strong arm bone charm that decreased the speed drastically. In Dishonored 2, the default time seems to have been increased as well, and I never found the strong arm's bone charm in the entire game, despite getting every single bone charm with the exception of one that seemed to be impossible in the first level. In fact, everything seems slower in Dishonored 2. Carrying bodies has a protracted animation that got me caught plenty of times. Same with the bizarre sword swinging animations that are much harder to parry, and this is combined with what seems like increased perception on the enemy's part on the hard difficulty that means I got caught significantly more than I did in the previous game. It seems buggier than the first game too. Sometimes I would get spotted by someone on a completely different floor than me, just completely out of nowhere. The moment-to-moment sneaking gameplay is actually weaker than Dishonored 1. How they managed to make a worse stealth game than the first is beyond me. But despite that, I said that Dishonored 2 mostly improves over the original. Why is that? Dishonored 2 is much less irritating in its story construction and actually has a tiny bit of charisma and personality compared to the first game. No more awkward Corvo standing around and doing what he is told. Alright, that's a lie. He does mostly still do what he is told, but he actually has a voice this time around. Corvo is voiced by, drumroll please, Stephen fucking Russell, the voice of Garrett in Thief. So my unvoiced wish was granted and I couldn't be happier. Stephen Russell's voice doesn't fit Corvo as seamlessly as it did Garrett, but it's a damn fine performance.
Maybe I got lazy. Fell asleep at my post. Somehow everything I love is at risk. Again. Last time I saw Karnaca, I was just 18, boarding a ship bound for Dunwall. It was dawn and I'd been up all night dancing 3 sheets to the wind. I was puffed up with the old Duke's favor, and I thought I was the greatest swordsman the Isles had ever known. For over 3 decades, I've lived in a palace, watching over the people I love. I've had an empress die in my arms, and raised another from birth. Who would have thought I'd come back home, the most wanted man in the Isles, following the trail of a monstrous killer? What would that 18-year-old think of me now?
They even gave Corvo a bit of a backstory in Karnaca, explaining that it was the city he was born in and where he learned to fight in the back alleys in the streets of the city. Russell's performance is less smarmy and cocksure like Garrett and more gravelly and confident. It works so well at dispelling many of the narrative issues that come with a silent protagonist. Even though many of the same issues remain, being a subordinate in the actual planning and doing everything single-handedly, simply giving him a voice and allowing him to comment on it makes it seem less artificial and not as arbitrary. The voice acting as a whole is a huge step up over the first game. The cast is star-studded from Vincent D'Onofrio as Duke Leah Bell to Rosario Dawson as Megan Foster, but Corvo really stands out from the pack with the inclusion of Stephen Russell. It gives him actual charisma and character presence. It's only disappointing in the actual writing of the character. There's an obvious and potentially effective character play that they could have done with him that I'm surprised they passed up on. Let's face it, Corvo has been betrayed by basically everyone in his life over and over again except Emily. So why didn't they make this an element of his story? An older, gruffer Corvo is slow to trust his new ally Megan Foster, and they could have actually developed a relationship. with Corvo slowly learning to trust people again. Corvo's character motivation still feels lacking, but unlike Dishonored 1, Stephen Russell's performance works as a band-aid to try and cover up the hurt of lacking character writing. Of course, Dishonored 2 has one other new and effective trick with its playable character. It doesn't have just the one this time. In the opening of Dishonored 2, it's 15 years after the first game. Emily has been on the throne for quite some time, with Corvo guiding her. It's the anniversary of the opening of the first game when Delilah, the villain from Dishonored 1 DLC, shows up and claims that she is actually the heir to the throne, and everybody should rise up and bow to her, and so they do. Immediately. Okay, so this is stupid on a lot of levels. First off, this completely invalidates the ending of the Brigmore Witches. Secondly, Delilah wasn't a very strong villain in the DLC in the first place, so I'm not sure why they decided to reuse her as the main villain of the next game. She's even more irritating the way she struts like a goth-flavored peacock around the throne room. Third, Emily has been on the throne for 15 years. Why the hell does everybody just believe the words of this show-off who just walked in? The hilarious thing is that if this was Dishonored 1, it would have actually been believable because Corvo couldn't say anything back. So in Dishonored 2, you can play as either Corvo or Emily, who has a new set of powers like Shadow Walk and Domino. Whichever one you choose, the other will be turned to stone and absent for almost the entire game. It's pretty cool actually, being able to play the game so differently depending on this choice at the beginning. It doesn't have any huge narrative forks where the story and levels completely change, but the dialogue and overall story feel does change pretty dramatically. They even go the extra mile differentiating them with some subtle changes like the sleep hold and holster animations depending on which Atano you choose. And yes, that little detail is confirmed. Emily is Corvo and Jessamine's daughter. Emily has the more unique and stealth-focused powers, but they are almost too good. Domino is insanely powerful and allows you to chain together multiple takedowns from the safety of a faraway position or out of sight, and Shadow Walk allows you to just bypass entire enemy placements altogether. The game seems to be specifically designed for these powers in some situations with just a plain stupid amount of guards in a single patrol that can't be dealt with anything in Corvo's arsenal non-lethally besides just stopping time. Corvo doesn't have any new powers this time around, but has upgrades to those powers that give him a bit more depth. Thankfully, they carried over the redirective blink from the DLC, although I would have liked to see pull given to him instead of Emily. Emily has her own form of blink called Far Reach, which has a further distance but is less inconspicuous than blink, which is the one bit of balancing they seem to give her over Corvo. Dishonored 2's commitment to character writing isn't significantly stronger than Dishonored 1, but the game seems to know it this time, and you don't have to go back to the Hound Pit's pub between missions. And there's no plot twist with aliens this time. Instead, the Dreadful Whale is your home base, a whaling ship that sits on Karnaka's shore, and the only person to talk to this time around is Megan Foster, the replacement for Samuel. She's obviously Billy Lurk, Daud's second-in-command who went into hiding after her betrayal in the Knife of Dunwall. There's virtually nothing to her personality-wise besides her affection for Sokolov, whom she met during the gap between games, but she's so much less irritating than any of the loyalists because of her straightforwardness. There's no obvious ulterior motives, although she is reluctant to tell you of her past. It's not because of an obvious betrayal coming later in the game. In fact, the dialogue total in the game has been significantly cut down compared to the first game, and that is very much appreciated. Without the betrayal 2/3 of the way through the game, the story can move at a much more effective pace, and with Delilah waiting out of view for almost the entire game, it's up to her constellation of supporters to provide the real character presence for the game. And they're actually pretty decent. They aren't all the same one-dimensional greedy monsters. The Crown Killer is revealed in the first actual mission to be Dr. Hypatia, except she isn't a straightforwardly evil serial killer. She was working on a serum that she tested on herself that had adverse effects on her personality. It created a separate split personality that eventually developed into the Crown Killer, and the non-lethal option is actually to cure her of this affliction. There's Kieran Jindosh, mentioned previously as the megalomaniac arrogant inventor whose non-lethal option is to use his own machine against him to essentially make him dumb. See what they're doing? The non-lethal options in the first game were too often too savage or just plain ethically murky to be considered the good option. They've adjusted them this time to be a little more considerate. Brianna Ashworth is the one person that Delilah actually seems to care about, and is dealt with by severing her connection to the Void. And finally, the corrupt Duke himself, who Corvo personally has gripes against. Corvo was a friend of the previous Duke and vocally dislikes what the new Duke has done to his home city. Luca Abel is more a villain straight out of Dishonored 1 with his motivations, but his non-lethal takedown is one of the best in the series. He has a double walking the palace with him as a defense against assassins. By talking to the double, you can convince him to turn against the real Duke and take over by claiming he is the double, another ironic reversal when you turn his own defense against him. And then there's Delilah herself, whose storyline is basically the same as Sylvia from Witcher 3's Blood and Wine DLC, just without all of the depth and solid performances. She's a disgruntled sibling who was cut out of the family while Jessamine got all of the respect and power. The idea is that Corvo and Emily and the player is supposed to feel bad because of her tragic past, but this half-assed attempt at drawing sympathy falls flat because of how one-dimensionally evil she is at the present and how much of a hammy show-off her portrayal is. She's more irritating than threatening or scary, and seeing Dunwall absolutely destroyed at the end with all the guards dead and witches laughing about all the blood and suffering kind of destroys any sympathy for her. Most confoundingly of all, her non-lethal takedown is tied to rune crafting, as arbitrary as it is. At this point in the game, I had never invested in it because I had more than enough runes that I could ever need anyways, so I was unable to perform the non-lethal takedown. Because of fucking rune crafting, like what? It's just as obnoxious and frustrating as the mandatory boss fights in Deus Ex Human Revolution, except for the dumbest, most arbitrary reasoning. I killed one person in my entire playthrough, and it was Delilah, and it's because apparently the developers thought to themselves, hey Dewey, you know what? We should tie the fate of the most important character in the entire game to a final level skill of the Bone Charm crafting tree. That's a great idea, Franklin. I'm sure nobody will be stupid enough not to invest 4 runes in crafting 1 extra rune, plus the readily available 20 in each level for free. What a bunch of boneheads. Dishonored had a jarring clunker of an ending. Dishonored 2's is somehow even worse because it did so much right before the ending. There's a ton of creative energy this time around, as well as improvements to some of the things that went wrong in the first game. But the thing they never truly fixed is the chaos system. Dishonored 2's morality is just as binary and restrictive as the first game's, and it's in the final boss fight with Delilah that I realized just how frustrating this system is. For the first time in the game, I actually got to experiment with combat powers, and it's really fun. You can stop time completely and run around and insta-kill Delilah's clones. You can parry her sword strikes or even projectiles with smooth and satisfying animations. It's such a shame that despite all of the brilliance of the level design and art style, its most fundamental flaw since the very beginning isn't even addressed mechanically. They made some concessions with the improvements to non-lethal takedowns, but the corruption of binary moral choice is still painfully obvious in its gameplay. I wonder what a Dishonored game would look like without the chaos system. It would look like the best Dishonored game, mechanically at least. Death of the Outsider is an expansion for Dishonored 2, and although it never reaches the absolute peaks of Dishonored 2 in terms of level design, the Clockwork Mansion and the Stilton Manor, it absolutely surpasses it in its mechanical construction, offering for the first time true freedom in its gameplay. The chaos system is gone, and may it rest in a fiery pit. I could make the argument that I'm disappointed they didn't try and fix it by giving the binary choice a bit more nuance instead of just making killing inherently bad, but I hate this system so much that I'm honestly just glad it's gone. But the most surprising thing about Death of the Outsider is that it's firing on emotional and artistic cylinders that the series never really has up until this point. The performances in Dishonored 2 were a substantial improvement on the first game, and Death of the Outsider takes its improvements in writing and substance and gives the best actors from the first game a go at it. Michael Madsen as Daud is even stronger than in the first game, his grizzled, raspy voice working perfectly for an older and worn-down Daud. This DLC is also the first time in the series that I genuinely began to care about its characters. Daud and Billy Lurk have history. Daud pulled Billy Lurk out of a life of poverty and danger, and he was a real mentor and father figure to her, and yet, Billy betrayed him. Billy has regrets. She still cares for Daud as the man who taught her everything he knows, and Daud still cares for Billy because she's the one person in the world who he has genuine affection for and one who he wants to live a better life than him. There's a connection, but strained by their past choices. The central story hook of the DLC is an interesting one, but still feels contrived. Daud wants to kill the Outsider because apparently he blames everything bad that happened to him on the Outsider's mark. Yeah, they don't really explain that. But the prospect of a further expansion on one of the more nebulous characters in the game is a good one, and the game succeeds mostly through Billy and Daud's relationship. Daud is old, and he's too weak to walk, let alone do any assassinating anymore, so Billy Lurk takes over as the playable character. Her already having roots in the first game's DLC, as well as the more integral role in the second game, means that she has a lot to work with, and does an admirable job taking the reins from Daud. Daud's not around for long, unfortunately, and passes away when Billy is out stealing a blade to combat the Outsider with. He leaves a final message, and it's the most somber and genuinely emotional message in the entire series.
But now, I find myself counting on you again. You have what you need. You will find out what to do. It's time, Billy. Kill the Outsider. Remove this terrible power from the world. For everything we did, and everything it did to us. I could have died 100 bloody ways. But in the end, here I am, on your ship, sipping your last good whiskey. That's not so bad. Thank you, Billy. And farewell.
I've made my appreciation for Daud known plenty in this video. I loved Michael Madsen's performance and his comparatively strong character writing. This final message is fantastic and a great send-off. While it's sad that the best character in the series is gone, I'm just glad it was done in the DLC that gives me real hope for the future of the franchise for the first time. That's in large part due to the mechanics being addressed in several areas that make it faster paced and slicker than either of the previous games. Not only is the chaos system gone, but runes are gone too. Your powers are fully upgraded right from the start, which means that you are free to experiment with everything the game has to offer as early as possible. In a full game, this might have been a little disappointing because there isn't a lot to work towards in terms of upgrades, but in the context of a DLC meant to be played after the main game, it's perfect. One of the few things that irritated me about the Knife of Dunwall was having to play the first level with the short range blink and without the double jump I had at the end of the first game. It felt like going back. Here, it's a smooth transition. Also finally addressed as the obnoxious power recharge time. Spiritual remedies are gone and may they rest in a fiery pit. Now the power bar will fully charge over a period of time after using Displace, the new version of Blink, so no more lurchy 5-second waiting periods. You can move fast and freely throughout the city and it feels amazing. The new powers are easily among the best in the series. Blink is gone and may it rest in a fiery pit. Wait, actually, no, I liked Blink. But Displace is better. It's more useful than Blink or Far Reach, instead placing a clone of yourself with one click and then teleporting to it with the next click. This two-step input means it has tactical advantages that Blink or Far Reach never really had. You can set a clone in a safe position, kill somebody out in the open, and then immediately teleport to that previously set position. The game also just straight up admits that the stealth system might as well be Far Cry's, so the replacement for dark vision allows you to fly around the map undetected and mark targets for later. I could see some people being irritated by this because it downplays the actual stealth, but less time spent in the ugly looking dark vision is better by me, and you know how I feel at this point about the integrity of the stealth mechanics of this series. The final new power is like playing the Lady Boyle level at will. You can steal an enemy's face for a brief amount of time, which works like a disguise and allows you to traverse hostile areas unmolested. I use this one a ton to scout out areas ahead of time, and with the more constricted level design, it felt absolutely imperative at times. About 2/3 of the way through the DLC, you are given a new weapon that is both a powerful and effective melee weapon, but also has a ranged attack. After breaking into the First City Bank and Trust, I mean the Dolores Michaels Deposit and Loan Bank, hidden in the bank vault is the blade that ritually killed the Outsider seen back in Dishonored 2. The bank is easily the best conventional level in all of Dishonored 2. I still think I enjoyed the Clockwork Mansion and the Stilton Manor more because of the creative level design elements, but as a conventionally designed level, the bank is outstanding. I made a little Thief reference just a minute ago because this truly is maybe the best bank level in a video game since that classic mission from 2001. You can even perform an optional objective by purchasing a chemical from an auction that can be used to render everyone in the bank unconscious. It turns the level away from its usual stealth mechanics into a challenge of making as little noise as possible and evading and shutting down the deadly mechanical traps guarding the bank from intruders. Electrified floors, arc pylons, and your old friends the Clockwork soldiers can be outsmarted in clever ways with Billy's new powers. One of the coolest moments in the DLC is when I figured out that displacement points can be placed in foresight. This electrified hallway is a little too far to displace past and there is no other obvious way around it, but by placing a displacement point on top of this door frame, you can skirt by this deadly hazard without being clearly and obviously told by the game what to do. The size and variety is what reminded me of that mission from Thief the most. The quiet and humble employee-friendly areas on the main floors, the trap-filled industrial lockboxes at the bottom, and the elegant excess of the director's office. The first 3 missions especially are some of the best in the series. It takes place in a new district large enough to contain the first 2 main levels and a wealth of optional challenges and secrets to find. This time, there is no heart or waypoints to point out every bone charm and room across the entire level. It wasn't something I ever thought about as a problem in the previous 2 games, but removing the heart and having bone charm locations be revealed when in close proximity means that the developers had to be a lot more careful with the level design. Without the training wheels of markers that can be seen across the map, the levels have to be designed in a way that corrals the player more directly to discover the bone charms. The result is a very welcome change in what I consider higher quality level design. The levels feel tighter and more considered than in Dishonored 1 or 2. The detail is generally above either of the previous 2 games as well, even down to something as simple as walking into an innocuous taxidermy shop to discover her basement of horrors. The large open hub of Upper Syria is surprisingly varied in its 2 major missions, first taking you to 2 semi-large buildings across the map, and then the excellent bank mission are the strongest conventional missions in all of Dishonored 2. There's only one misfiring level, and that's a reskin of the conservatory from the main game. I know that designing new levels is hard, but out of all of the levels to choose from, I'm surprised they chose the weakest of the lot. But the final level makes up for it. It's the birthplace of the Outsider, an old abandoned mining town now home to the eyeless cult. It starts off relatively conventional but gets weirder and even more surreal as you progress towards the void. And then there's the void itself, easily the most beautiful and intimidating scene in the entire series. The massive obsidian skyscraper, the wispy shifting black air, and the whales circling the tower is jaw-dropping and the most distinctly Dishonored sight yet seen. Death of the Outsider's one real gameplay fault is the lack of non-lethal assassinations. Without the chaos system and the faster pace of the DLC, the main goal of missions is not to eliminate targets, but to perform detective work and work towards the goal of confronting the Outsider. It feels like something is missing, but here at the end of Dishonored, but the beginning of the Outsider, it brings back that mechanic one last time. You can spare the Outsider, freeing him of his omniscience and restoring his mortality by speaking his name, which turns out to be the Outsider's mark itself. Very Planescape Torment in that way. But only the dead can speak the mark. Thankfully, Daud is there to do it for you. He makes one final appearance, and you actually have to argue against killing the Outsider to pull it off. The final scene is simultaneously the most compelling and engaging voice acting and emotional work of the whole series, but built on a contrived foundation of Daud wanting the Outsider's death. I still don't understand why Daud believes the Outsider turned him into a monster instead of taking responsibility for his own choices like he did in Dishonored 1. It comes out of nowhere and isn't explained well enough to make it a narratively consistent story hook. Contrived story hook regardless, it still works because of Daud and Billy. This DLC did something truly unprecedented by making me actually care about its characters and getting me engaged in the dialogue just as much as its level design and gameplay. Death of the Outsider is the best Dishonored game. Not only does it polish up and address many of the core issues of the gameplay, not only does it sport some of the strongest levels in the series, but it even works emotionally. And most importantly, it shows just how much more satisfying a Dishonored game can be without the moral posturing of the chaos system. I just wish the series would have learned that lesson sooner.